Hi, I'm Blaine Scully, former professional rugby player and international captain, three-time Rugby World Cup veteran, and currently pursuing my executive MBA at the University of Oxford. This is The Game Plan.
Blaine Scully, thank you so much for joining me on The Game Plan today.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Well, as you know, the game plan is where we discuss the athlete's journey beyond the game, but I thought maybe it was first important for us to dive a little bit into the origin story of the man that Cardiff fans have called Captain America. So going from never having played rugby in high school to a collegiate All-American, you said that rugby sort of found me. And when you find what you're supposed to do, it all clicks. So maybe let's start there. How did rugby find you, and what was the moment that it all clicked?
Yeah, it's probably the best way to describe it. And, I think I grew up just like every other American kid, playing and competing just about everything and loving every minute of it. And, as you do when you grow up, you have to pick a few sports because you're not able to do everything you'd hope to do. And so I ended up playing water polo, basketball, and swimming in high school. My dad and brother were college football players, but mom did a pretty good job of steering me away from that. And I went to Jesuit High School in Sacramento, California, and we actually had a really good rugby program. I had a lot of friends who played on the team, and they won a national championship actually. And my original intention was to go to school and play water polo in college, and ended up deciding that wasn't what I wanted to do. And one of my friends who I graduated Jesuit with ended up saying, "Hey, you should really try this game." And I was at UCLA at the time.
Yeah.
And like you just kind of said, it was what I was supposed to do. It was like everything I knew and loved about every other game kind of combined in one thing. And I just kind of let it take me.
Yeah, and I we had your coach Alex Magleby on Game Plan Season 1, and he shared that, look, given a shortage of spots for international players, coming from the U.S., right, international in the U.K., he opted not to pursue a full-time career at the international level. You walked the path less taken, and you actually competed for one of those highly sought-after spots. So for the casual, let's say, rugby fan that maybe is catching it on the Olympics this year, talk to us about what it takes to make it to a team like the Leicester Tigers, like the Cardiff Blues, and was there a backup plan if maybe plan A didn't work out?
Well, fortunately, I graduated from Cal, so that was helpful, from at least as a starting place to work back from. But so I was fortunate and started playing for the national team while I was still at Cal, and started doing some sevens assemblies and international sevens tournaments. And then I graduated in 2011 and made the 15s World Cup team at that point in New Zealand. And then kind of jetted back to finish the competing with the sevens team for the Pan American Games, because I guess it's kind of useful for folks to understand the difference between sevens and 15s.
Yeah. So
sevens is now the Olympic format, and it's sort of a derivative of 15s, which is the more traditional game. That's has really established professional leagues over in the UK and Oceania and Africa and the like. And back then sevens was not as full time. There weren't as many fully contracted programs. With the Olympics came substantial investment, and so when I was kind of playing in college, it was more of a development vehicle for the 15s team to go into the World Cup and then hopefully go overseas. But kind of 2012, the USOC supported our program, so I graduated, taking one of the first training contracts down in the OTC Olympic Training Center. But my goal was always to go overseas. It's really what I wanted to do. It's where all the best players from New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and of course England, France, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Italy, all those countries who play rugby as close to their national game as it is for football or basketball and baseball for us. It's where I wanted to go and test myself and be able to first and foremost, I think, represent the national team and also be the best version of myself. So when I came back and participated in the national team, it was actually a real pathway for development for me and actually a way for me to continue to pursue rugby and also play at the national team and not necessarily have to sort of duel, which a lot of my teammates had to do as a 9 to 5 job
Yeah.
plus international athlete, which is obviously incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I mean, how much of a, I guess, culture shock was it for you, obviously playing at the highest collegiate level and winning the championships there, but then moving to a country where there is a massive audience for it, and you are seeing fans that are giving you nicknames and following along with you, and you are able to make a living out of it, compared to, say, something like the Premier League system, where you've got the multiple sort of tiers and rungs. How much of a culture shock was it for you going from here in the US, where rugby isn't as well known, to then where in the UK, where obviously it's at that level?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it was a really interesting thing. I went to Leicester, which was my first club overseas, on a trial, and 2 weeks kind of turned into 4 weeks, which turned into a couple of years, which then I ended up going to Cardiff after that. But yeah, I mean, there's no experience quite like leaving everything you've known your entire life and showing up super jet lagged and jumping in on the wrong car seat for the driver to take you up to a whole new world. But yeah, it was an incredible experience, and like I said, I went in with no other expectation than that I was, one, going to give it my best shot, and two, really enjoy the experience. And thankfully I was really, I think, as prepared as anyone possibly could have been, thankfully, for my Cal education, going through the program there, and learning from some of the finest American rugby minds who have had leadership positions within USA Rugby and American rugby at large, having played for the national team, coached national teams, captain national teams. And so I kind of understood, I guess, at a maybe a more fundamental level, what it meant to be a professional, and I wasn't going to miss out on that opportunity and bring sort of my best self and really, like you kind of mentioned earlier, compete for one of the very few foreign spots that were available. Because naturally those leagues are in the business of also developing their own national team players. And so, typically there's only 2 spots on the field at any given weekend, and Americans will be competing with Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, everybody, to be able to earn one of those spots. So it's competitive to get a contract, and it's probably even more competitive to actually get on the field, which is obviously where you wanted to be.
Yeah, and well, you were able to do that, so much so going on to a 10-year storied career, 3 Rugby World Cups, and then captain of the U.S. Eagles and the Team USA. And then the past year, in 2020, you hung up your cleats, and I thought your announcement video was beautiful, where you said, sport is temporary, and sometimes the game moves on, and that's okay. It's just the start of a world that I haven't yet found. Take us into that mindset and maybe help me understand, like, where that confidence came from to say that it's okay, it's time to leave the game behind and, maybe move on to a step that isn't necessarily clear.
Yeah, it's. I think it's a process, really. Honestly, I'd made a commitment to myself as a 19-year-old kid, effectively, that this is what I wanted to do, and I was going to be committed to being as good at the sport of rugby as I possibly could be. And I think after that 2019 World Cup, the plan was always to take some time off and talk to my wife and those closest to me about what was next. And because she made a massive amount of sacrifice moving overseas to be with me, leaving her professional career so we could have an amazing experience. And I think as an athlete, you have to have some. It's just by very nature of what's required is you have to kind of put your career first. You have to spend lots of time training. You have to spend lots of time watching video, lots of time stretching and foam rolling and all those different things. And you have to pass up on weddings and parties and all those sort of life things. And and even move to a different country, which is what we had to do. And I kind of, at that point, it was the right time to have kind of a truly reflective moment. I had left Cardiff, and we actually did have a few offers to potentially go back overseas, but I think when we kind of talked about it, because it was very much a team decision, it was, look, I was fortunate to do basically everything I'd hoped to do. And, I think I'm at the point now where the game will end for me probably sooner rather than later at this point. And I think it's time to kind of get out in front of that and really start to kick the tires on what's next and potentially what I want to do for the next chapter. And that definitely wasn't easy, and it's still an ongoing process because you leave something you were so committed to and you knew so well, and you hopefully got pretty close to world class at, and now have to go be a rookie again, which in some ways is super daunting, and like I said, other ways it's really exciting as well.
Yeah, I think your career interestingly overlapped with, I think, the last decade of sports, where we've seen a lot of capital and investment into sort of the non-core four, right? We're seeing minor leagues. I mean, there's like 6 different spring football leagues. And yet the missing, I think, piece, despite how Team USA has shown up on the international stage, is the investment and maybe growth of U.S. rugby. So before we kind of dive into the future of Blaine Scully, I'd love to hear your perspective on the growth of the sport in the USA. And, as USA Rugby emerges out of bankruptcy, what are the 1 or 2 things that are kind of like the missing pieces to awaken the sleeping giant?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And I think all sports everywhere are now kind of grappling with this sort of existential question, around what does post-COVID kind of look like for us. I mean, I think it's a really challenging environment, but as you say, there's more, maybe perhaps more opportunities as well for emerging sports to kind of gain a foothold. And rugby, I think, has a really interesting it's kind of value proposition, I think, in general for the United States. And the reason why I say is we one now have the Olympics, which is hugely important from a validation point of view, and getting athletic departments and programs to support it, which I still believe is American sporting superpower. Is our intercollegiate model and what our academic institutions provide, and especially for smaller Olympic sports as well. And I think a big opportunity there is women's rugby. So women's rugby is the fastest growing sport on the planet.
Really?
And
wow.
I think in the U.S. it has a potential to be the next U.S. women's national soccer team and really kind of be kind of the tip of the spear, so to speak, just because we have so many incredible female athletes, and would love to see that program continue to get investment. We have Major League Rugby now, which is a new startup league, which is in its 4th season, just completed its 4th season. And I think there's an opportunity there. They have 13 teams in 13 different markets, and that's great because it sort of decentralizes the investment in the sport at a more regional level, and they have incentive to develop fans, create programming, which again, from exposure, that's really kind of key, is how do we expose the game to young athletes? How do we capture them along the pathway? And then you're more than likely to be a fan of the sport if you participated or at least know what the sport is. So,
right.
That is an opportunity. And then, maybe some international investment in the form of international events. There's been talk around the Rugby World Cup coming to the U.S., which would be massive. And, again, so there's all these sort of levers around top line visibility with some of the international sports, sevens in the Olympics. Hopefully some investment down the value chain from the pathway program from the 10-year-old to the MLR athlete. And then you throw in the international component as well. And then hopefully with that recipe, we can create some sort of sustainability to continue to complement the grassroots and all the effort that goes in and day out with all those people who kind of grow the game locally.
I think the digital distribution component too. I mean, adding on to sort of what you mentioned there, it's like now, Peacock and TikTok even, right? You can see sort of highlights on there. I think that was the craziest thing, where there were sports that maybe weren't getting showcased during the Olympics that had massive love on TikTok because somebody would say, hey, this is equestrian, and like I've never heard of this thing, but it's now getting millions of views. There's probably opportunity there where you're not competing for the same time slot, with football on ESPN necessarily.
I 100% agree, and rugby actually had a pretty good moment with Lona Mar, who's one of the female athletes, and she stiff-armed, I think, one of the Japanese players like 3 or 4 times in a row. It was like the Derrick Henry moment, and like
yeah.
And so the Lions got on that, and they promoted on their social channels, and again, yeah, you're exactly right. The digital distribution of like, well, what are these crazy people doing without pads, and why are they tackling each other like that? It sort of democratizes that access point, which typically had been restricted to those like, really, finite linear blocks that would be like during primetime TV.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's so interesting as I was, looking back on some of the interviews you've done, some of the conversations you've had is, learning is something that you have pursued off the field in a lot of the things you're passionate about, and done a lot of it through reading, but I think just broadly immersing yourself in new topics. And it's so interesting for me because whenever, we've done 65 plus episodes of the show now, that's usually the first question that comes up, which is like, okay, I retired, now what? And I think the ability to sort of, learn a new skill set, learn a new trade necessarily. So maybe let's start there. What have been some of the most helpful resources for you, whether programs or people, that have helped you as you've approached life after rugby?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tricky one because I think to have any success as an elite athlete, you have to be all in. But at the same time, like we just kind of talked about, you have to sort of recognize that there's only so long your body will be able to do it. Full stop. That's just the way it is. And so that sort of continued investment piece, and not in any monetary sense, but investment in thinking about what you're interested in, what you like, and then also in people and your network and building that network. And that was always something that has been really important to me. I had amazing mentors who invested a lot of time in me, and whether I was on the field or off the field, and then kind of through those mentors be able to gain access to other people and have more conversations, kind of chase curiosity is kind of like what I've always tried to do.
Yeah.
And I always found that helpful, and because at the end of the day, you might not necessarily come away with a clear action item out of any given conversation, but you usually lose very little, and you usually gain more information, which is always super helpful. Yeah. And so that's kind of been my mindset. And I retired at probably the weirdest time. So I went retired in March 9th, and then we went in the lockdown a week later, and which was kind of a really strange thing, because I was really looking forward to kind of getting stuck in and exploring all these different peoples and hopefully doing a bunch of shadowing. But in other ways, it was, amazing because my wife and I got to be fully home with and fully present for our little baby girl, which was great as well. But yeah, you're right. It's kind of, chasing that curiosity. I think, thankfully, that sort of, lifelong learner mindset and growth mindset has kind of been ingrained in me. So I really probably can't even take credit for that. And then it's just, trying to continue to put yourselves in situations where you're stretched and learning, and hopefully ending up in a place better than where you started.
So speaking of those mentors, what was maybe the best piece of advice, or maybe the most counterintuitive piece of advice that you got as you were talking to folks about, hey, I think I'm towards the latter part of my career, and I'm starting to approach life after it?
What you do first isn't necessarily what you have to do forever, right? And I think from an athlete perspective, because you're so committed to one thing, and this was still a sort of struggle for me is around decision making around what you're actually going to do next. It's trying to take some of the pressure off on getting it 100% right on the first go, which I think is obviously such one of the athlete mindsets that makes us, I think, really valuable hopefully in a professional work setting, and as part of a team, is also to our detriment during the transition process, because we hate being bad at things, and so that sort of ends up in this sort of like negative mindset around like being harder on yourself, when you just kind of have to be real with yourself, which is like, this isn't where I am at now. I'm not always going to be kind of learning from scratch again, but kind of recognizing that is really kind of an important part of the process. And so that advice, kind of reminding myself of it, really just kind of taking the pressure off on thinking you can all of a sudden be a data scientist and do all these things that you wish you could do. It's just, you have to take time. It's just like anything else. Like, you don't get in the weight room and get stronger overnight. It's, the repetition, it's the training program, and all the sort of consistency that you need to bring in order to develop. So
I think that's a really valuable point that maybe doesn't get talked about enough, and I'm using the comp of, let's say, an NFL or an NBA athlete that retires and immediately goes into startups or investing in venture capital. And I think, publicly, there's a lot of people that are like, oh, what do they know? Right. And the thing is, like, well, they're just learning that, that when you spent 10 years single-minded focus on just getting better at one craft. And for a lot of people, once they retire, they have a massive amount of opportunities. Yeah, I can go work in a company. I can go advise a startup. I can do consulting. A lot of people go back to business school, which I know you've done as well. We'll talk about that. And it's one of I think it's a really beautifully said point, which is the more you can immerse yourself, the better it is. And I think the challenge is that people externally don't necessarily understand that, and they say, "Oh, what does he know about startups? Right? Why is he going and doing that?" And so I think it's an interesting point to consider.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know, speaking of which, startups and venture capital are two things that you've become passionate about. You've been immersing yourself in. What started that passion, and how were some of the ways you started exploring it as a player?
Yeah, I actually don't know. Maybe it's because I'm from Northern California, but I went to school at Cal and that whole thing. But a lot of my friends have ended up in tech in one way, shape, or form, and there's I think it's just a really interesting space full of opportunity and innovation, and people who are pushing the envelope. And so I really, I feel kind of connected to that space and drawn to that space. I think I have tons to learn, and grow, and that's sort of what seems to be the mindset of most of the people I've met in that arena. There's so much out here, so much possibility, so many cool, new, exciting things, kind of waiting to, get funding, or waiting to start, but waiting to build and grow and scale and make a difference. And just kind of I found it to be a really exciting, and interesting space that I've enjoyed all the people that I've gotten to know so far, and I hope in some way, shape, or form I end up back there someday. I know I have tons of work to do personally before I I'm ready to kind of be on one side or the other. But I think from a macro level, tech and the way we interact with the world is forever what it is now, which is every company in some way, shape, or form, every firm is a technology company. It's just a degree, and I've just kind of seen that transition as an athlete, and the amount of technology that we use on a day-to-day basis, and how that changed, and now over COVID, how quickly everything's had to shift to a tech and media company. How do you connect with your fans? How do you aggregate data? How do you improve performance to that data? The fan experience, second screen experience, gamify the experience, all that kind of monetize that, and so it's just be a tech and how that is delivered, venture, how tech is funded, and how the sort of ecosystem all sort of complements and wraps around itself. It just kind of find the sort of systems that make it go really fascinating.
Yeah, you spent some time advising a few startups. Obviously, you've worked with the sports technologies yourself as an athlete. What surprised you the most about maybe seeing how a startup is built or run from the inside?
It's interesting. I even in some of my advisory roles, I think they're probably it's still like sitting in the living room, so to speak. You're not really the back of the house, because I know from some conversations just how hard it is. Oh yeah, my chief of staff left and my head of product left, or whatever it is, and I was like, man, and you're the founder of the company. You've invested 3 years already, and however much of your own capital, how much of everyone else's capital, and that's real. That's life, but at the same time, be able to wake up and work at it is really kind of, I found it pretty inspiring. And so, I mean, I think it's just, it takes a certain mindset, I think, and that I really respect, and a certain resilience, and like you kind of said before, a certain confidence as well, that you can make something work. And so the one of the ones that I'm advising is Sportable, which is really innovative company. I talked with the CEO a few times, and he's just he works at it every day, and early mornings, late nights, weekends, calls all over the world. It's really pretty impressive.
Reminds you a little bit of being in the grind of making a USA rugby squad, or making it the international level, right? It's
Exactly.
no shortage of dedication there. I'm glad you brought up the point about hiring. I think it's one of the interesting, I guess, linearities that I've seen of companies that hire athletes, because I think there's a level of drive, there's a level of dedication, passion, the book study, and actually diving into the work to understand it. And speaking to Alex Magleby, I asked him, if he had a question for you, and the number one question that he had is, you've been such a leader, you've led, teams internationally and here in the US. What are some maybe leadership lessons that have stood out to you that apply off the field as well as they did on the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my sort of key learning points, and I think every sort of young athlete who is given team responsibility kind of goes through this process where, originally when you're young, all you have to do is kind of show up and do your job. And in some ways it's so easy, because you literally just have to do what you're good at. And make sure you comply with the team and its kind of rules and regulations, know your role, know your job, and then go out and execute it. Then the more time you spend with that team, you continue to add and be expected to have more and more responsibility, because no longer it's just about you doing your job. You're responsible for making sure everyone else does their job, and then also being custodian of the culture, and maybe having a bit more of a relationship with the head coach and the management around things that are affecting the team or potentially affecting the team off the field. And so the scope of your responsibilities kind of gets bigger and bigger. And I think kind of through a lot of my own hard personal lessons was kind of reminding myself that I'm a teammate first. And I've seen and been a part of a lot of teams where and probably myself as well, as all of a sudden if you're described as a team leader, or you're given sort of the captaincy, you think you have to be somebody overnight. And what got you the captaincy was who you are, not on you going out and speaking louder in the huddle and all that kind of stuff. So I think recognizing that you're still a teammate first and foremost, that you have to make your own tackles, because nobody wants to listen to the person who's not doing their own job first.
Right.
Which is such a key reminder, I think, for every young athlete, because your collective responsibility, you still got to do your own job. In addition to those, it's not, you don't get to pick and choose anymore. And and then at that point you have to learn where you can sort of build in some support mechanisms and sort of decentralize a lot of those roles, because I think that sort of the idea that you have to do it all yourself is one, unsustainable, and two, not best for the team, because the team needs multiple voices, they need multiple leaders. And so building sort of a leadership group is hugely important for any sort of captain or team leader, and because that sort of then distributes that sort of team ownership, which is crucial amongst the team, and hopefully that can continue to feed itself down and then feed itself back up and create a self-reinforcing mechanism. So those are kind of we could talk for hours on this stuff, but those are kind of the top three that I always kind of say: be a teammate first, make your own tackles, and then make sure you get help.
Look, I really like those, and it ties into and I'm not going to misquote the person here, but somebody that I really respect interestingly said, org charts are almost built upside down, because you have the CEO on top and you have the sort of rank and file at the bottom. And I think the best leaders kind of recognize you're actually here in service of the people who are quote unquote on the front lines, right? The guys who are really in the mud and making the tackles, and whether it's like as a captain, as a coach, as a manager, right? Your job is to really remove obstacles in their way. And unfortunately, because of how compensation structures and everything are tied up, the higher up the rank you go, the more you become, you start sort of thinking that you're that they're here to serve you as opposed to the other way around. And so I think, speaking to the point of like making your own tackles and really remembering that you're a teammate first, realizing that you're here in service of your teammates, I think is a perfect leadership lesson from that standpoint.
Yeah.
And you, I know you covered some of this on the Captain's Code, so I would be remiss if we didn't talk about that a little bit. You spoke to some great guests, you spoke to some great business leaders. Who are some of the ones that stuck out to you, or maybe what are some lessons that you still carry with you from those conversations?
Well, I mean, two of my favorites were both my coaches at Cal, and they both had a huge influence for me. So, they're probably top two. And then, Al Guido was who's the president of the 49ers. He has had an incredible experience and added, I think, an incredible amount. And we had a really interesting conversation around legacy of, say, in the history of an organization, but how do you make it your own at the same time, and which is a challenge for teams all the time, because although we might have past expectations built in, each team is new, different people, different relationships, different year, different contexts, and so kind of recognizing that the uniqueness of each team is really important. And it was a really sort of incredible sort of learning experience for me. Doing the Captain's Code I was much more comfortable doing interviews than facilitating them, and so like sitting on the other side was a real experience for me. And but again, the idea was sort of how do we translate kind of this athletic experience into some of the success that a lot of these folks have realized on the other side of sport, and all of them kind of by and large said the same thing, same thesis that we've kind of talked about. Yeah. And it's just such a powerful reinforcing message around the value of sport, and it's so much more than sort of wins and losses. It's the lessons, it's the connections, it's kind of the overall value that it can bring to someone's life, and then how they can be so enriched by that, and then enrich others as a result to knowing what it's like to be a good teammate.
This feels very Ted Lasso, Blaine. I don't know if you watched that show, but
yeah, I watched Ted Lasso.
Yeah, no, it's kind of this fascinating realization.
The show makes me nostalgic. My wife and I watched it the other day, and we're like, man, I feel like this was me in the Cardiff locker room.
There you go. Yeah. That's true. You were Ted Lasso before his time, but well, look, this has been a fantastic time. I'll wrap on one question that we love to ask our guests. As the show is really about the experiences of athletes and really making it a lot more known that athletes are doing amazing things off the field. But I would like to ask it the other way. Looking back on your career, looking back on sort of the stage you are now, taking the next step after rugby, what is some advice that you would like to give your younger self?
That's a great question. I mean, I think what I would have said to myself is don't take any moment for granted, but then also, make sure that, because there was a few moments where I was so focused on performing that I maybe missed out on some of the sort of wider experience stuff, which I don't actually regret at all. I was there to do a job, and that's what I wanted to do. And but I actually had that opportunity in Japan to be able to reflect and really enjoy and embrace that experience. And I think it's so easy to get caught up on in the grind, as you kind of said, around being a pro athlete, but recognizing just what a sort of cool opportunity it is, and to be able to do it as long as I did was a real gift. And so just kind of being thankful for that, I guess, each and every step of the way, because my coach used to say the more grateful you are, the more willing you are to work for something, and never kind of losing that as kind of like a foundation would be something I'd always want to remind myself.
It's a great place for us to end, Blaine. I think it's important to have gratitude. And I think as we all get caught up in sort of our day-to-day of achieving our goals, I think taking a step back and maybe looking backwards and saying, hey, look how far we've actually come is a good reason to remind us why we're working so hard. So with that said, Blaine Scully, thank you so much for joining me on the Game Plan today. And we look forward to having you back soon as you take your next step, post the world of rugby.
Absolutely. Can't wait. Thanks again for having me.